Should be possible now.
Yes. So if everybody can see my screen.
Yes, I can see it. I think everybody can see it if I can see it.
Is it too big or too small? I can make it bigger.
A bit bigger might be.
If you could enlarge a bit, better perhaps.
Okay, I can do that. This. How about now? Better
Yes,
or
but
bigger? You want bigger?
This is fine. This is fine. Thank you.
This is fine? Okay, Coach. Thank you. First of all, as always, I think we all have to thank Alfred. Alfred is my hero because it's to commit one's life to the expansion of Heidegger reception, your own original contributions over the decades on the scholarship, but just that type of, what's a good Heideggerian word? Not just the Entschlossenheit, but the actual structure of the commitment is ständig, it's constant. And the passion is just always, it's inspiring for all of us. And then you've gathered us to support each other's work. So we always have to thank Alfred and Holger again. But Alfred is the one that's constantly working for the preservation of Heidegger memory. Let me start with the title. And I have to say on this topic of the Schwarzhefte and the decades of the debates, obviously before Heidegger died, denazification, but certainly from the 80s onwards, all the scintillating and controversial works, many bad works, Furious onwards, that created these debates. I'm very naive about this area of research. I feel like a child. So please critique my simplistic views about Heidegger, the person, compared to the works. I focus on the works, and I know that's not how you're supposed to start a discussion about Heidegger's Nazism. Say, I'm not going to focus on the Nazism and Heidegger, the person. I'm just going to look at the works. So what I'd like to do is read the abstract. We're not going to be able to read the whole paper, so I'm going to jump from one main section where we're doing a close reading of Heidegger. And in the backdrop, it's the old tale of Moses meeting God at the burning bush. So those of you that are familiar with the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and regardless of what tradition you may have come from or not come from, or traditions that you were brought up in but discarded, I think if you've seen the movie The Ten Commandments, and if you've seen, it's interwoven into the history of Western civilization, founding monotheistic moment. It's when Moses meets God for the first time at the burning bush, and he declares his name, I am who I am. So that's the part of the Hebrew Bible that I'll focus on. But my main focus is on on being in time. The Judaism inside being in time that Heidegger could not see on the secret of Heidegger's anti-Semitism. This article will set up the possibility of reading chapter 4 of division 1 of Being in Time on the who question of Dasein, while reading the transliteration of the actual Hebrew. So I have some very minor training in biblical Hebrew, one semester. So I'm not an expert, and I'm not a theologian, and I'm not a biblical expert, but I want us to look at some of the Hebrew, if it's okay, even though many of us may not be familiar. On the who question of Dasein, while reading the transliteration of the actual Hebrew of chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, Shemot in Hebrew. This is where Moses meets God for the first time, and God reveals his name. I am who I am, but we're going to see the temporal complexity of this, the futurity of it, the I will be aspect. Lots of thousands of years of debates about this, obviously, but typically you might see from the Septuagint Greek, I am who I am the being. From that, I will preface by saying that Heidegger, the actual person, may have been an anti-Semite and Nazi, whether he disclosed the Schwarzhefte or not. I mean, imagine if he didn't. Plenty of people want to say, yes, of course he was a Nazi. And one step further, he's an anti-Semite. Whatever that means, he's an anti-Semite. He made the actual person, but being in time, my thesis is not anti-Semitic or Nazi at all. By no means can the philosophical work be reduced to the terms of official party doctrine, or for like Alfred and others who really looked at the history of his life, the opaque, contradictory, hypocritical, ambiguous, self-defeating decisions that Heidegger the person made. If you read any biography of Heidegger, it's quite famous now. I mean, just the complexity and ambiguity of the human being. Let's give him some respect as a person before we demonize him or, judge him, that he made in his life while critiquing, deconstructing, and separating himself from the essential biological racism of the Nazi Party, given how he treated some of his Jewish colleagues, Husserl most notably, not going to his funeral. And for the biographers, he treated some of his Jewish colleagues in a diabolical and cruel manner. So we won't focus on that. Like I said, we'll be focused on a very close reading of Being in Time. Being in Time, for me, my intuition is that it cannot hide the uncanny resemblance and philosophical, not the human Heidegger psychological torture, his breakdowns, the suicide attempts, and going to the Krank house and rehabilitation. I'm talking about the philosophical torture Heidegger had to endure leading up to the birth of Being in Time and beyond. That is from separating the task of fundamental ontology and the ontological difference from not only the history of Gentile, not Jewish, Western metaphysics, ancient Greeks to German idealism, and medieval scholastic theology religion to his present. His project leading up to Being in Time and shortly thereafter fails, the big failure question. We talked about that yesterday. But as we know from immediate post-Being in Time and the later Heidegger statements and published lectures and writings, this should not be understood in terms of an incompletion or loss. So it's not about Vollendung versus incompletion, or is it a game or a competition, winning or losing? Rather, it's an opening passage to a decision, thinking about how Being in Time speaks to us, not as a project that fails, but incomplete. So we want to get beyond this notion of failure, think more deeply about it. The opening passage to a decision, another decision, direction about how we must position ourselves in that failure in terms of the authentic demands of thinking, not conceptual philosophizing. So later Heidegger on thinking, end of philosophy, no more philosophical concepts. That means questioning our time as having the need for renewed thinking, not of ourselves in relation to the historicized past, but the enigma of being at an epoch, and this epoche, suspension, indifference, the question of time itself, as I'm interested in, is not about how we the same or different from past epochs. We're not going to get into discussions about modernism and postmodernism. I don't want to do that. Also, we will not focus on the traditional arguments in Heidegger's care turning from the Dasein, analytic, and fundamental ontology, early Heidegger, to the Ereignis, history and truth of being, later Heidegger. Instead, we will try to develop a novel hypothesis that Heidegger cannot see and therefore conquer the possibility of a deeper temporalization in the mystery of the relational event of Being in Time in the Hebraic heritage, not the Greek and German, and in specifically the Exodus text, going back to the Hebrew Bible's first 5 books. One simple reason: Heidegger was not at all grounded in Judaism, Hebrew, or the Jewish intellectual tradition, like many of his Gentile philosophical contemporaries. Alfred, he was only in the Jesuit seminary in 1912, I don't remember, he was young, for 2 weeks. But because he was sick, he quit. And those of you that know about Jesuit formation, at least from what I understand, they do Latin and Greek, of course, but they have to do, maybe back then, of course, the actual biblical Hebrew of the Old Testament. So, I don't know what he got in those 2 weeks. Probably nothing. He's not immersed in this tradition, so it's not fair to criticize him for not knowing it. Like many of his Gentile philosophical contemporaries, Heidegger the person gave birth to the radical original work, Being in Time, which questioned and spatialized linear time and Innerzeitigkeit within time-ness in chapter 6 of Division 2. But once born, the text not only takes on a life of its own, it's fundamentally flawed in terms of the gap or margin it cannot fill. The quaternal temporalization in the Hebrew Bible's Tetragrammaton. So from the Jewish tradition, you can't say these words, you can't say these letters. You say other things like Elohim, God, Adonai, Lord, Yud Hav Vav Hav, from the verb hayar, to be, but that's the sacred name, which of course is irreducible to Greek metaphysics, to German idealism, and for sure Christian theology. It's the unpronounceable name without subject or predicate, that which is that cannot be surpassed by any ontic entity. For example, an active dynamic substance or presence, debates about Anwesenheit versus the present signal, now point, Gegenwärtigkeit, typical ideas of the present. These are just words. This phrase appears 7 times in the book of Exodus in chapter 3, 1, 4, 7, 15, 16, and 18. The passage from 3 to 4 remains unthought, And the sad thing is that we're not thinking about it, to play on Heidegger's words at the end, the Spiegel interview. It points to the impossibility of a future messianic conception that Heidegger cannot foresee, precisely as he tried to destroy the first beginning of the history of metaphysics and its ontotheological entwinement with the history of scholastic and Protestant Christianity and the idea of the parousia, the second coming. All the while, he did live for a time as a Nazi Party member, and in his lifetime, and now, has been accused of being an anti-Semite. That is his fate. So I'll bypass this section where I make a criticism of some of the current works. Jean-Luc Nancy wrote The Banality of Heidegger, playing on Arendt's work, famous phrase, and is very critical of Heidegger and Western metaphysics in general. Self-loathing, hatred, the Christ-killing machine that unleashes the anti-Semitism that then becomes unconscious. That's Jean-Luc Nancy. I don't want to get into that critique of Heidegger. So I want to go to my actual reading of Being in Time and Moses. Rather than trying to save either Heidegger or his philosophical writings, most notably Being in Time, from ascriptions to Nazism and anti-Semitism, to say nothing of Heidegger the person, who by Wolin and many others have been fully convicted. He's been tried, judged. We talked about this yesterday, but he's dead. You can't save him. Fully convicted of being a Nazi and anti-Semite. We're going to go to another realm. We'll look at the slow reading of Exodus Shemot, the countlessly retold story of Moses, the freedom of the Jews from the Egyptian enslavement, the handing down of the commandments, the very foundation of the Jewish identity. Historically, some people say 9th to 8th century BCE, maybe older than Homer, or the first 5 books of the Pentateuch of the Hebrew Bible, allegedly penned by Moses according to the myth. Nobody knows, historian believes that, but that's the part of the tradition. The primordial events in monotheistic human history, the first time Moses meets the unpronounceable and unsayable Yud-Ha-Vav-Ha, Elohim Adonai. The name is double revelation and concealed, Lord and God, instead of pronouncing the name. Okay, so I'm now ready for an actual page 9, or 13. All of this theology and religion we know is inadmissible in Heidegger's undeniably original philosophical breakthroughs. In fact, even as the ground, the causa sui, the being of all beings as the transcendental creator, is irreducible to all beings, the being God's is essence and existence is one. To go back to Aquinas, the very being of God as transcendence and the ineffable one truth of all being, it's all still ontic. That's the genius of Heidegger. Oh, wait, all that transcendental conception and scholasticism, it's ontic, it's present to hand, ready to hand, it's the inauthentic. That's the New Testament to Aquinas of the 20th century. All theology is ontic. The ontological difference between being and beings, whereby time is the horizon, not time as a metaphysical question that can be answered, but as the horizon for understanding being, as you know. And of course, Dasein being the existential analytic, that is ecstatically thrown, projected movement, as a primordial finitude of temporality. That's my conjunction of phrases. But let's read Heidegger carefully. That too, quite frankly, is still ontic. We have to be careful. Metaphysics may try to name the soul, and theology tries to name God through attributes, but neither Dasein and the meaning of its being is temporality, nor the standalone question of the meaning being. They cannot be explained in metaphysical, scientific, or theological attributes. In contrast to both notion of being as presence, unconcealedness, self-showing, phenomenon, logos, and the Christian God, including the history of metaphysics, Dasein's being is ontically distinctive in that it's ontological. You know this, you're all very familiar with this. But by no means is this ontically distinctive as ontological clear. I mean, it's distinctive ontically because it's ontological. This is the case if we cannot draw from Gentile Western metaphysical religious ideas, the locus of judgment in the human subject, as Richard said, starting with Plato. All that's being destroyed, along with the entire history of ontology. So where does this leave us in this particular investigation? There's no simple starting point which would give away all of our cards. What we're suggesting, I'm not reading the text directly, I'm speaking to it. What we find is an uncanny resemblance, perhaps Wittgenstein's family resemblance, between the Mosaic account of the theophany and the face-to-face encounter with God's speech, rather than the revelation of its being, and what Heidegger does not really develop further and all the great distinctions he makes in chapter 4, division 1, on the who of Dasein. The question of the who, we should be led to certain structures of Dasein, which are equiprimordial with being in the world. So they're all there together. You don't line them up and say one from the other. Being with, Mitsein, Dasein with, Mit-Dasein. Being grounded in the mode of everyday being oneself, Selbstsein. That doesn't just mean being alone and being in a room by oneself, as you know. And then the explication of this mode will enable us to see what we may call the subject of everydayness, which includes Dasein. We're all in it too. Well, it's all these things together. What do we count? 4 things, amazing, in the who, which is not simply answered. But the problem is that we're stuck in, all of us, in one way or another, fall into and are trapped in and get caught up in the Gereda and the chatter of everydayness, everyday flow of time. We get curious and amused by it because we're all stuck in the day. Similarly, it would appear in the book of Exodus that you only see 2 entities or discussants in Exodus, namely Moses and God. But there's more. Underneath the entire text is one massive interrelations movement event of being in time itself. In Heidegger's chapter 4, division 1, we have not only the unanswered question of the meaning of the whole, the Ganzheit Dasein, whose fundamental state is being in the world, but also the question of the who, Dasein, is. Much later, we'll see the being of Dasein that's grounded in Zorga. Death is the possibility of impossibility, but it's also the greatest possibility to be, never something in time, not perishing and just physically dying. Phenomenologically, we bracket that. We're talking about death as possibility. And of course, what I care about is all of this is rooted in his discussion, section 65, ecstatic, primordial, unified, authentic, temporalizing of time. That forms the ground of being, of care, dread, concern, Zorga. But the interconnectedness of this whole interrelated movement is concealed. There's no New Testament Jesus here either. His passion and his being towards death himself and the cross. Well, that's religion. At that earlier moment in division 1, Heidegger wants to link up certain structures that are equiprimordial with being in the world, if we want to take all that who stuff and bring it down to this question of temporality. Because God's name is precisely the announcement of the project of being in time, as I'll argue. Let us admit we are not dealing with some Cartesian dualism, subject and object, not post-Kantian. And for now, I'm going to say it's not Hegel's treatment of substance and subjectivity and the contradictions in the history of metaphysics. How does he try to overcome that? Trying to take it to a whole nother level. We know we're not dealing with a single human being, ego, self, or I. He says that consistently in the beginning of chapter 4. Don't think I'm just talking about I. It may not be I at all, like me right now, or you. What the Mosaic encounter in the book of Exodus and Heidegger's who question so mysteriously developed in chapter 4 of division 1 have in common is this. We are simply not in this physical empirical world of space and time. Any kind of withinness, the inner, as an inner Zeitigkeit, in general with regard to space and time. But we're also not in the world because stretched possibility of being, we're ecstatically outside ourselves, rapturously, and in and for ourselves in this finitude, which is not simply a now point, but because we have the anxiety towards death that makes the transcendence of the world happen. He says this right in Being Time. You don't need to go to the later Heidegger to get this. The happening is not of an event order that happens in time or as time. We do not even want to say this. We are in the world to transcend it. Jesus says, I'm in the world, but not of it. I've overcome the world. This is in this passage. Or we transcend the world by not being in it. Oh, we're not really human beings. We're just some demigod like Hercules or Zeus, or some mythic thing. Neither nor afflicts us because we both speak to human passions, which practically every philosophy and religion has tried to attest. But we're not in this religiously mystical realm as negative theology. So Eric, I'm inviting you to talk about the philosophical mysticism. How we read the 2 texts simultaneously speaks to the simultaneity of the archaeorigin that is crossed out, hence an impossible simultaneity. The who is Dasein, is as structures that are equiprimordial, structures that can be developed out of the Mosaic encounter with God who has no name other than these mysterious 4 letters. It's blasphemous or idolatrous to put the name into single quotes, but that's not our intent. We're just talking about us reading the letters, and I'm trying to understand. Okay. I just want to take us right into the temporal structures of being in time. I'm at 10:23, Alfred. We have to end at 10:45.
Yeah, more or less.
Okay, I'll end at 10. Hopefully by 10, before 10:40. Maybe 10:37. We'll have about 8-9 minutes for the questions discussion. Okay, back to Heidegger. Heidegger's who structure of Dasein, being with Dasein with, being oneself in the day, is not simply mapped to God as being. Moses is Dasein. Moses' eventual liberation of the Hebrew people is Dasein with. Moses up in the mountain receiving the theophany by himself as being oneself. And all the Gentiles like the Egyptian Empire of the past as the day. We're not doing a simple mapping. This is not what we intend to show. It would be impossible to prove that Heidegger intended to appropriate the Exodus tale and then repackage it ontologically in Being in Time without acknowledging the inspiration from the Jewish tradition. Other people like Nancy can talk about Heidegger being jealous of the Jews and stealing and training and loving so many Jewish, Hannah Arendt, of course, and learning and exchange. But he's just a bad guy that steals from the Jewish tradition. I'm not getting into that debate at all. I'm just saying that I see this resemblance, and I want to know if it's possible to think about Being in Time in a different way through the Mosaic lens. We are not saying that Being in Time intended to, or in fact, does erase the Jewish text in rewriting it. If the Nazism of Heidegger's historical present tried to erase the Jews, that same cannot be said of Being in Time, regardless of what we think of its author. Being in Time is an authentic falling from a more authentic temporalization as something four-dimensional, and that's the concluding moment where he's trying to deal with Hegel on this very issue. Rather than looking into the text, the movement of ecstatic temporalization in the name is linked to the problem of freedom, transcendence, and decision. So I already see this in the Mosaic name, this problem of ecstatic temporalization, freedom, and transcendence. I will be, and the repetition who I will be. We have to unpack as they point to all the major issues tackled in Being in Time too. In the book of Exodus, we can speak of a falling into and a falling from the temporalization, not the disclosure of God's name. The temporal horizon of the whole chapter 3 in Exodus has to be articulated. Can't just isolate the moments and think of it as a linear tale. I don't want to reproduce the actual text. I think you're all familiar with it. Moses goes up to the mountain very early on, sees this burning bush. The fire's not dying. He's like, oh, it's not moving either. That's the beginning of chapter 3 in Exodus, and it culminates in the very famous 14. God said to Moses, I am that I am. Those in the Hebrew studies and Jewish studies with the actual Hebraic text, it's too complex. I don't want to minimize it at all. From the earliest rabbinic traditions through their High Middle Ages, Maimonides, up to modern Orthodox conservative reform reconstructionists. And then the German translation by Buber and Weisenfeld, Alfred, you may know that, but in the translation into the German, it becomes I will be. I will be there. So it's not I am. Forget about I am, that I am, I will be there. I will be there. Dasein. Throughout the book of Exodus, which gives us a temporal horizon that we can compare and contrast with Heidegger's primordial, ecstatic, finite, authentic, unified, temporalizing temporality. We know for Heidegger too, futurity has priority due to anticipatory resoluteness and being towards its end. In coming back to itself, it dislodges itself from that inauthentic present in order to awaken the more authentic present, which is not a present now. So let's not simplify Heidegger. Let's not forget the Zu-Kunft that Macquarie and Robinson tell us has a kinship with Zu kommen auf, to come towards or come up to. Moses coming up towards, coming at the bush, coming up to, and its derivation from Zu, to or towards, and kommen, come. And even more boldly, we hear the very next page in section 65, the coming, the Kunft. None of this requires a subject or object. Noun or verb is subject or object. We all know that. He breaks that hermeneutical circle. He takes on Kant and Descartes and everybody else in the beginning. We're way deep into Being in Time. Don't think about any of these things phenomenologically as pointing to linear time and ordinary ideas of time. I'm interested in the movement, Equiporean movement. None of this requires a subject. For sure, do not conflate Zukunft with Zukunft, the latter of which has the ordinary conception of calendar time as ahead of the present now, or displaces the present now, nor can even say follows the present now as in coming after, whether it's ahead of the now or following the now. The point is we normally think of it as another now yet to happen, tomorrow. No, instead we have the wondrous mystery buried in the coming, kommt, the Zukunft, and the Zukommen. And then even before the discussion on these terms and the translators, it's this hard phrase that nobody understands. Zukommen lassen, letting itself come towards itself. You're not releasing oneself from some original point like birth, and then I'm going to come to my death, but it's something has predestined me to determine me genetically to let myself come to my actualized end. There's no teleology. It's not that simple. Let's maintain the ambiguity in the German. We do not want to assume that Moses is likened to Dasein with these problematics. Zukommen, zulassen. Sure, Moses does turn aside and in a way comes to the burning bush. God in a way also relates to coming and coming towards. Literally, the burning bush may not move itself from one location to another. It stays in place as the fire moves around without consuming it. We can stretch things literally and say God's speech is what comes to Moses without any human instruments. But that's not the point. And in revealing himself to Moses for the first time, God says that he's come down to rescue his enslaved people. He tells Moses he's sending him. He says, I will be with you. He will be with him. I will be with you. So the name is also attached to the action. Moses himself, as he knows, I'm sure, he's very scared. He doesn't know what to do. He's confused. He's going to be this rescuer and deliverer. So even in their interrelations is a series of comings and a complex event. Is Moses the receptacle of an unmoved mover, which moves Moses, but then somehow maintains relation with that movement? Coming down, being with, become crucial here when we think of chapter 4 in division 1 and 2 on ecstatic temper, chapter 3, division 2, ecstatic temper. We have a long way to go as we've yet to get to the who question itself. We just introduced it. While fleshing out the other two ecstasies in section 65. We just talked about the future, but what about the other ones? We will need them before we get into the all-encompassing mystery, which I won't have time to do today to get into the actual Tetragrammaton. But we'll do a little bit here. The Yud-Hav Vav-Hav of the unpronounceable name is derived from Hayar, the verb to be. But in the disclosure, when a being is talking to Moses, this entity is saying the Hasher this right here. So although this is the unpronounceable name, that doesn't show up, ironically, when he's speaking to Moses. It's this Hasher And here are all these different attempts to translate it. I am who I am that I am, I will be who I will be, I will be that I will be. Again, no subject-predicate relations here. There's no I. There's the non-circular relation is to by the who or the that, between two. Let's keep it in its own complexity there. The stretching and tangling knot of the who cannot be derived from past, present, or future and does not operate by any time and eternity distinctions. Let us say we're dealing with a four-dimensional, because of the name, stretching along a self-stretching event. The coming towards having been making present, the future in the process of having been, I my having beenness, binning, I'm going to get into some of that. Ecstatic temporality, you might think it involves three, but it involves the epiprimordiality of the relationship between them too. We're getting to a deeper groundless ground, to quote Richard, even long before we get to the later Heidegger. I want to let's do some more work on the past, bring it to the present, and I'll conclude in 6 or 7 minutes. Here in 65, Heidegger discusses the past as it already was, that is to say, it's been, sein gewesen, only insofar as Dasein is, I am as having been. It's as if he's speaking from some transcendental perspective, godlike almost. I mean, we don't talk like that. I'm as having been. Can Dasein come towards itself futurely in such a way that it comes back, authentically futural, it's not out there tomorrow, but is always involved in coming back? Dasein is authentically as having been. Anticipation of one's uttermost and ownmost possibilities coming back understandingly to one's ownmost been. Not just a projected future event of death, but truly trying to come back to oneself from the fallenness. Only insofar as it's future can Dasein be authentically as having been, the equiprimordiality of that. And then the having been arises in a certain way from the future. We don't want to speculate about the affinity, contiguity, let alone possible conflation equation of the authentically as having been and the coming towards itself futurely. The simple example I use is I'm not talking about going back in time and seeing what it was like when I was a baby. And right now, I don't want to race ahead and go meet my death and just, but I can't stay in the present either. And I don't want to even be caught up in the present to hand and ready to hand inauthentically. So we can imagine the scenario in the present, which would make our death as a possibility, an extension of the present that we're seeing now, and that it is impossible. But that is impossible if our death will not occur in our time. So his changing of the conception of death is not something that you just see other people die and then you say, okay, it's going to happen to me someday. We can say the coming towards itself futurely, the coming back, and the I am my having been as arising, they're not attributes of a super movement, but they do point to a dynamical interrelated complexity. It's also not the burning bush, and we're not talking about resurrection and reincarnation, Christian registers. Before moving on to the authentic present or making present, let us see what the translators have had to say about the question of the past. This I have been is expressed by ich bin gewesen. This might be translated as I am been, but in the context we had ventured to translate it as I am as having been. And furthermore, here the character of having been, die Gewesenheit, binhood, distinguishes, we know this, from Vergangenheit, just like Anwesenheit is not the Gegenwärtigkeit. Same distinctions, ontological distinctions being about the very understanding of time. Binhood is distinguished sharply from Vergangenheit, pastness. But we're going to just, in English, have to call it having been. But you can think about binhood. You can even say something like binning, as you'll see. We prefer to retain the ambiguity of the translator in English that the translators did not offer because of its awkwardness. I am bin and binhood. When we get back to the name in God's name, you think it's I will be or I am, and you think, oh, that's future, that's present, but it's I was, and I will be what I was, and there's all these other permutations that can play within the four-dimensionality. Coming back to itself futurely, resoluteness brings itself into the situation by making present. The character of having been arises from the future in such a way that the future which has been, or better, which is in the process of having been, releases itself from the present. This phenomenon has the unity of the future, which makes present in the process of having been. That's his big formulation, at least this culminating moment. And that's what he means by temporality, not time. Okay, I want to spare us any more agony of me trying to read this. And of course, I won't have time, which is the crux of what I wanted to introduce, but that's fine. We won't be able to do it. This whole other half of the paper is really about what I then developed as the four-dimensional problems and questions within the name itself. But my inspiration is all those little moments in 65 for sure, static temporality, everything that follows, chapters 4, 5, and 6, division 2, Heidegger is my guide. I'm not trying to convince anyone about something theological or religious. But it is shocking if you go into the etymology of the U to have the four-letter name, the high R2B, and the temporalization of what happens in the A in Exodus 3:14. This is just from biblical kind of Hebraic studies resources. But wow, to be, become, come to pass, exist, happen, fall out, occur, take place, come about, come to pass, come to be, arise, appear, come, exist, be in existence, abide, remain, Yavalikite, whiling with my time, company, be with, mit sein, mit daran, occur, Agnes, come to pass, Ubergang. How about this? Sein sind be to be done, to be finished. These are all Hebraic registers. And I will tell you that if you know your Exodus, this is chapter 3. He's meeting God for the first time, but then, the story continues. He's with his people and, he's still with God. And then he says, look, okay, I'm really going to do this. I'm going to go save the Jews. How am I going to do this? One guy, this empire that's enslaving people. And he's like, don't worry, just calm down. Don't worry about it. I'm going to be there. Because, but I need something more than the name. I need to see you. And we know this prohibition, the anti-idolatry, the anti-metaphysics of presence, first commandment. And he's like, no, you can't see me. Nobody can see me and live. God's saying this. So you can't see my face. I know we're friends. We talk, and now you know me. You know my name. So go out there and help and save the people. And he goes, now I need something more. So finally, God says, okay, I'm going to put you in a rock and cover your face. I'm going to pass by and alongside and through and on, like as in leave you behind. You can't see any of this movement or this event of time. This is me philosophizing about the Hebraic text. But you will be able to see my back. And don't think of him as a body, and you don't get to see his face. You just get to see. He meant the remains and the traces of everything that encounter means. So I stop here because what I want to argue is that unlike the Trinitarian structure, and I don't want to reduce Christology, two-natured, divine and human substance of the one Son inside the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, which equals again one. I don't want to get into the complexity of that, but I'm inspired by the Hebraic tradition in terms of the possibility of rewriting being in time in a more complex way with this kind of four-dimensional lens, the ecstatic temporality. And of course, that has consequences of how we're going to deal with Heidegger later on treating Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and eventually Hegel. And then I see all these semantic registers here. So if I were to conclude, what Heidegger couldn't articulate is that to rethink the name is time, God's name, and the being of it is the mystery of time itself, articulating what it will be beyond any human register. And I link that up to being in times, all of Heidegger, early up to way to the end, about the destruction of his Gentile Western metaphysics. He's destroying Plato up to Hegel, and then he takes on Nietzsche, and then he's kind of like the threshold. It ends, as Derrida says, but then there's a closure, and yet there's any critique of metaphysics takes place within it, as Lee said. I say that the way out is to just develop a deeper dimensionality of the relationship between time and being, like a missing division 3. And then the subthesis, this is my last point, is if this is true, well, at least this possibility, and most people would care less about what I'm trying to say in terms of the Heidegger scholarship, then I don't want to get into such simplistic debates about Heidegger, the person being the terrible Nazi. And he is a member of his time. Again, it sounds so childlike. Maybe it's very irresponsible to talk this way. But I'm going to take the tension he felt as a person and see it in the text and say philosophically, he wasn't too far away from Judaism. Deseverance, he was too close. But he was a Nazi and an anti-Semite. He didn't like that. He couldn't talk about it. So all of us, many of you may be Gentile. I don't know. You may say, look, I never grew up Jewish and I don't understand the tradition. But, that it's that proximity to the possibility of being in time, having this futural project of articulation inscribed in this other tradition that faces the history of this terrible history in the West up to Nazism, that he's too close and yet he couldn't admit it. And it's not his job. He's not around. We then have to bring as a tribunal testimony and about these possibilities that, hey, Heidegger, this is what your missing division 3 could have gone towards. Or we go down the Christian route, and that's a separate project altogether. I've talked about that in the past. Thessalonians, Parrhesia, et cetera, et cetera. This is something different for me. And I want us to entertain it as a possibility. So thank you. And I look forward to any remarks or questions. Sorry about the disjointed moving back and forth between the text, but at least you have a basic understanding of my thesis.
Yes, we do. Thanks, Rai, for your presentation, as usual. We don't have much time left for further discussion.
I know. I'm sorry.
I don't know if somebody has a question or remark, you can slip in a few. Yes, Eric.
Hi, thank you,
Hi,
Raj.
Eric.
It's always pleasure to hear you, to listen to you. It's obvious that you only gave us a small taste of something larger on which you work, and I and you need to speak more about this when we have
Yes.
this.
Yes.
Fascinating. Yeah, I know there is an entire sphere of modern scholarship which seeks for certain relations between Judaism and Heidegger, and I'm not very much familiar with this side of scholarship. I know Wolfson even writes interesting things about the interpretation of Kabbalah and how Heidegger.
Yeah, right. It was right.
Yes, and he thinks maybe Heidegger was influenced through Schelling, which was explicitly related to Kabbalah tradition, but he doesn't claim any explicit relations, that only the nearness of ideas, which I think what you do as well. And so I just had some associations and some interesting questions which we need maybe to speak more later. But what do you think, for example, about this concept of having being in Heidegger? And as I understand it, he never means past in a way that yesterday I ate a sandwich, so now this
Exactly.
is part of my having been. I don't think this has to do with any actual event that physically happened in the past. But for example, as I understand it, the death of God is a having been of modern humanity. And it's never really happened as an event, as an historical, factual event, but it's something that constitutes a modern understanding, modern philosophy, modernity as such. This is the death of God. It is part of our having been, something that is sort of continuity of something that Nietzsche revealed as something that already happened. And maybe we can also think about the Torah or a story of Moses in a similar way, not as a myth, not as something that really happened, but as having been as a certain way of revealing an element of destiny of the West, of our thinking, of our spiritual path, and we can read maybe the Torah in this way, as similar to the way the death of God after Nietzsche constitute the having been of humanity. And I think it's also relates to the fact that it's important to in being in time to notice that it confuses many scholars that Dasein is too closely related then to personal human being. So it might seem if we're talking about many Daseins, as if everyone is a Dasein, and there it's just but the Dasein for Heidegger is an aim. It's sort of human quality, we can say, which is human in a very strange sense, very unhuman sense. And we only aim at this quality of Dasein. And maybe, yes, through Heidegger or through a certain interpretation of our having been from religion, we can somehow proceed towards Dasein. Just some random thoughts.
Eric, we could have a whole seminar on your response, as if that's a whole paper. You have your own paper we have to witness, see tomorrow. But thank you, Alfred. 60 seconds response, because I know you have to end.
Yes, fine.
This is on a personal front. Some of you may not know that I'm at Brandeis University, and that's the founding university in 1948 when Israel was formed. Because there was anti-Semitism in the U.S., there was afraid that that wave of pre-World War II Jewish immigration, that coming from the Eastern Europe and think about the poorest, not the Western European migration that of course happened after World War II, Frankfurt School, for example, before World War II, sorry, and during and after. But it was the persecution of the Jews here in the United States, and that this Brandeis was formed, and Marcuse was brought here. He wrote all his big, great works here. But you know your history, all of you, that he wrote to him. I think it was after the denazification, saying, just say something, Heidegger, please. Say something. You taught us Marcuse's great work in the late 20s on Hegel and Heidegger. Louis, Arendt, Jonas, I mean, I can go on and on, but he goes, can you just, and of course we get the famous statement about, well, it's all the machinery of the technical modernity and the nihilism that, how did they, after the occupation, the West treated these German soldiers. So I have to live in a situation. We have a profound relationship with Israel, so I've gone there, done my visiting professorships in the philosophy department. I've met scholars. It's fascinating. There's scholarship on Heidegger in Hebrew in Israel, secular, philosophy of science even. But I wanted to know, can we translate? Being in time being translated into Georgian, I would imagine, in every other language. But we're waiting. Some of us want to see the translation into Hebrew on this very crucial matter. But the responses by the current literature, there is, of course, lots of work and has been. Peter Gordon, for example, started it years ago, but others too. The founding figures of the different strands of Judaism, Orthodox, conservative, Heschel on the conservative side, Soloveitchik on the modern Orthodox side, Wieselgrad did his dissertation on Kierkegaard and Heidegger. Fackenheim did Hegel and maybe not Heidegger, but I'm talking about PhDs in philosophy, but became rabbinic theologians. They couldn't ignore him. So that's another side of it, is like, well, what can we bring from Heidegger into this realm, knowing full well that we have to deal with the Nazi and the anti-Semite. But what distinguishes what I'm trying to do is, I already put my cards on the table. I'll tell you, as a person raised as a Hindu in the United States, having broke from that structure and very critical of its metaphysics, and having passed through Christianity over 2 decades and into and then out of, that my only true resources have always been now that I have some familiarity with the languages, the Hebrew Bible, New Testament Greek, and Latin. What he does in section 81 before he gets to Hegel, you hear from Plato and the Timaeus, you hear from Aristotle's Physics, and you hear from Augustine's Confessions. Time is an extendedness of the soul, but I don't know what the extendedness is. It's not just the numbering that we get for movement, but it's the aporia, as Derrida talks about too, inside Aristotle, that intrigues Heidegger. And then, of course, confrontation with spirit and time in Hegel. It's all philosophy. But in the West, we have these 2 pillars: New Testament Christianity, Greek and Latin, and of course, all the different Western traditions, and Orthodox. I don't want to exclude great Eastern Orthodox fathers. Maximus the Confessor is one, many, but the Greek Orthodox traditions. But we got the Latinized Western structure, but we have the Hebrew Bible. And that is the secret groundless ground that makes possible the chance to go beyond being in time in terms of extending the discussion of temporality. It's an inspiration, but there's no statement about what that tradition means. I can't speak to it. I'm a Gentile. And I certainly don't want to disrespect another tradition, but it's a type of Eightman appropriation that something in Heidegger prevented him from doing. And he had a chance. He's gone. It's too late. So we have to try to forge ahead. That's my perspective.
Okay, thank you, Ryan, once more.